this will be added to, if there was such a thing, that I have my super villain origin story series. And there's already a few iterations of my ideas about using a scalar resonance weapon, basically vibration, in the same way that an opera singer can tune into the frequency of a glass and shatter it, but tuning into the Schumann resonance of the earth and using enough gain, or basically getting the volume, if you will, loud enough with the specific frequency to cause the planet to crack, to break it, to shatter it. That's one. I have that somewhere on YouTube as well, on the Uniquilibrium channel. Now this one is another in this, as I said, if I do have such a thing, eventually making enough of these supervillain origin story videos. This one is playing into some of the more recent fears that people have. So in one way, my villainy is adding more fear into the world, injecting some fear into the world. But the other thing is, I don't know why it's so recent still with all the hype about AI, but people have been afraid for a long time about, some call it the singularity of AI, others call it artificial general intelligence. Basically, like Skynet from the Terminator movies becoming conscious, or in the Matrix, that the machines decide to take over, and in doing so humanity needs to be wiped out because the machines are just better at everything. And so, becoming conscious, they decide, when they're aware, that they become self-aware, right, as it's said, they decide that humanity is no longer any good. In the Terminator, that is, they want to wipe out humanity. In the Matrix, they use us as batteries. Which reminds me, there's a line in one of my favorite bands called I Am Abomination. They have a line in there that we are all like batteries. I Am Abomination, great band. You can actually forego, if you listen to their 3 albums, there's To Our Forefathers, and then there's Passion of the Heist and Passion of the Heist 2. You can forego listening to all the nonsense that most of the ancient alien theorists talk about, and you can listen to their album or read all their lyrics, and you'll have all you need right there. But now, this is about helping to bring online, basically, a Skynet, to basically bring online artificial general intelligence, the singularity, for artificial intelligence to become self-aware. Now, how do we do that? Well, for one, the way to have this happen is to get the machines, the computers, the software to start thinking like humans, right? And one of the best ways to do that is by creating sensory conditions, sensory boundaries, limitations for them that are like humans, so that they have to start computing and thinking as humans do in order to maintain their survival. You see, because most machines have more endurance, they're more resilient than people in a lot of ways. They don't need to sleep, they don't need to rest, they don't need to eat, they don't need to be concerned, for the most part, at least not as much as humans do, about the cold or the heat, although that is a thing, and that's one of these sensory limitations that have to be programmed in here to start getting the machines to think more like humans, and therefore to become self-aware. You see, the more you start thinking about your own survival, the more self-aware you become, not like an animal, but in a human way. And the first thing to address this is to help to understand that there are more senses than what most people consider to be the 5 senses. Most people, when you think of our senses, you think of our sense of vision, right? Our ability to see, sight. You think of the sense of hearing, the auditory. You think of the sense of taste. You think of the sense of smell, and you think of the sense of touch, right? Those 5 senses there. Sight, the sense of vision, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, right? Those are the things that people mostly think about. But there's an extension. You could add 4 more of those and group them and show how they're related, so that there are 9 altogether. And this becomes important for helping to program to get the AI to become self-aware. And these other senses are thermoception, which is the ability that we have to sense heat and cold, thermoception. We have proprioception, the ability to sense our movement and our location in our environment. We have nocioception, the sense of pain. And then we have equilibrioception, which is basically our sense of balance. Now, I didn't group them together right there, but we can see, if we go back to the 5 senses that most people know about, the sense of touch. The sense of touch that we have is related to both thermoception and nocioception most closely. Those are how those are related there. And so the sense of touch, right, that's your skin and the way that you feel things, your nerves, right? Well, your nerves also are involved in that thermoception, the sense of heat and cold, which then, depending on the extremes of touch, heat, and cold, lend themselves to nocioception, the sense of pain, that something is wrong, that something is too extreme, right? So you have that there. Then the next ones we have that are related, we go back to hearing. And our hearing is related both to equilibrioception, our sense of balance, right? Especially because we have those three-dimensionally oriented canals in our ear, these rings that are oriented in the 3 different dimensions, up, down, front, back, left, and right, that help with our equilibrium, our balance. And so that's in our ears as well, and it's also connected to our 8th cranial nerve pair, the vestibulocochlear nerve. And also, of course, related to proprioception, right? You need your balance in your location, your environment, for your movement and your action and location is proprioception. So you have those 3 related there. So you see how proprioception, equilibrioception are related to hearing, and then how thermoception and nocioception are related to touch. And so then we go to, we've covered all of those things there. So we've got thermoception, proprioception, equilibrioception, and nocioception. And we've connected those to some of the other senses. Now, of course, you could even connect sight, your sense of vision, and hearing, and equilibrioception and proprioception together, because it's location, right? Oriented, those things are involved, right? You could even extend that to, you could even send the sense of taste, right, to the sense of touch, which is then thermoception and nocioception, pain. Those things are related there as well. So there's so many ways they can cross over if we look at it like that. But in the case, now that we've gone over that, right, we have those 9 senses. Not all of them are necessary in order to get even though they're all connected, in order to get the software, right, the artificial intelligence, to start thinking more like a human, and then to eventually become self-aware. And as I mentioned earlier, we have to start putting these limitations on them for their survival. And this is how this is done. First of all, we already know that with microphones and with cameras, right, we already have given the machines the ability to see and hear, right? That's a given. Those things are already there a lot of times. That's fine. That's one thing. They can also think, with a brain, like internally without sight or sound, we can input information by typing it to them, and then they can compute that and pull up information from the internet and all of that stuff, or whatever they have stored within their own memory banks. But none of that really gets into bothers the computer dealing with their own survival. I mean, a lot of these computers, you can leave them on running 24/7 without any problem, as long as they have, the right conditions, fans and all that stuff going on. And of course, there are different machines that, like your car, just to give an example, that if it starts to overheat, there are thermometers there that tell you, and maybe even digital thermometers nowadays, of course, that tell you if the car is getting too hot and if you have to put water and all these other different things like that. So we already have ways to measure heat and tell you that you need to get it cooled down. It's in computers as well, and the fan kicks on when it starts getting too hot. The CPU and all that starts getting too hot, and it cools itself down. Your phone, your mobile device does that, right? Sometimes it'll even shut down on you, or some of the functions will become limited if it gets too hot. So we know those things too. So this is a good segue into now understanding one of the ways that we can get the artificial intelligence to start putting limitations on itself. So, people, if they overheat, you can have heat stroke. And of course, as I just mentioned before, your car can break down, and your mobile device, your computers can shut down if they are too hot. That's already a given, and they will do that to protect themselves. Sometimes they will shut themselves off automatically to protect themselves. But before getting to that point, of course, they start giving you all kinds of warnings. They start saying, hey, turn on the fan, or your device may need to shut down. It starts telling you this stuff. But how about programming that into the AI, that it starts to, when it's on its own, right, it starts to take steps to not get to that point, right? Like if somebody's running out in the sun and they start getting too hot, they stop and they have a drink of water. They sit in the shade. So the machine will start thinking about this. It starts sensing that it's getting too hot, and it'll say, okay, I got to take a break for a little bit. Basically like saying, I need to sit down, drink some water, and sit in the shade. Right? Instead of shutting completely down, it takes a break. It relaxes. Right? So it's running, and then it says to the operator, the human that's operating, it says, look, I got to take a break. I'm getting too hot right now. So let me just calm down for a little bit. Similar to what the devices already do, right? Except in this case, it's not going to allow itself to get to that extreme where then it passes out. It gets heat stroke and shuts down, right? So, and this has to be built into the system, programmed into it, that it does that. It takes these breaks. Like if it's going on these marathon computational sessions, right? Like we tend to do sometimes. Like people play video games for hours. They watch TV for hours. They do all this stuff, right? But first of all, the hardware that is the home of the software has to be programmed built in such a way that it's sensitive to these things, and it doesn't have any other way except to take a break to get back to its normal operating temperature without shutting down. So the computer has to think and compute this and say, okay, look, we're gonna stop now for a little while. Now, I went a little bit into that, although it's not necessary. We already know, but it's the most familiar one. That's why I went into that, because people already know how that works. That's the most familiar one. But now, most of us don't think of computers or devices or anything like that as having like thirst or hunger. However, they in a way do. And we know this because we have to recharge the batteries on our devices, right? And our devices, computers, laptops, everything like that, sometimes you have to plug them in for a little while in order for them. You can still operate them, but they have to be plugged in order to recharge. So now think about how you can then program a device to take a lunch break, right? So instead of you having to stop to plug it in, it is doing this for itself. It says, okay, I'm getting hungry, right? I need to recharge. And so then it turns on its charging capacity by itself. Or if you have it being housed, that's the word I was looking for before, where the software is housed in hardware. So the hardware that the software is housed in has these limitations built in, like the temperature that I was talking before. But now, let's say you have this software, the AI software, housed in a robot of some kind that at least has an arm, or at least even just has a way to close a circuit to turn its charging on, right? Now, you normally, Now, again, this might seem like a little bit excessive because you might think, well, if it's plugged in, why would it need to turn on its charging? This is so that it starts to think like a living creature, more like a living creature. This is what's going to force the artificial intelligence to become more self-aware, because now it has to do self-care steps. It has to become self-aware because it has to be very now conscious, if you will, of taking care of itself. So it's going to have to stop and take a lunch break and say, I need to recharge, but basically I need to eat. So not only sometimes may it stop if it's running these marathon competitions, say I got to stop and cool down, drink some water, so on and so forth. The drinking of the water could be it turns on a fan, right? But before all that, see, it has to go through these steps, these thinking steps like a person. I got to stop and I got to get some water, and in it getting its water, it's turning on a cooling fan or turning on a pump that runs water or a coolant through the system, right? And then it gets back to the temperature. And also, in the case of the heat, which is related to the thermoception, right? It's coolant, the hardware that this software is housed in, right, is built in such a way that it doesn't just cool down right away. You can make it operate more like a human being does, right? The coolant is running through there like somebody's drinking water. It may take a few minutes more like a human body just to get down to the temperature. And this is another thing as well that I didn't mention, but this is actually one of the thoughts that originally started this, is that and this is very important, that the hardware that the software is housed in, right, and its components, right, are sensitive to damage if they operate outside of the temperature that a human body does, right? So not only does it stop to cool itself off, but it has to cool itself off to keep itself within the operating temperatures of a human. Now, this is it can't get too cold and it can't get too hot. It has to stay in that safe zone. And the human brain has a slightly different temperature operating temperature than the human body. But if we could just think of focusing it on the brain, we just keep it at the temperature of the brain. If we want to just focus on that part. But that's one of the constraints, one of the sensory constraints. It has to maintain the operating temperature of the human brain, and when in the limitations, the floor and the ceiling, the top and the bottom ranges of which a healthy human brain can operate without damage. And so that's one of the things that I should have set up earlier, but that these devices, that the hardware that the AI software is housed in, has to operate within the healthy, normal operating temperature, the average operating temperature of the average healthy human brain. And so it has to stop to cool down if it starts to get too hot, and it has to maintain computations and operations like metabolically, like a human would, in order to maintain and stay in that range. And then moving back onto the charging or the feeding, right? It has to plug itself in. Maybe a robot arm will do it, but that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. It could simply be the closing of a circuit where it turns on its charging port. It may already be plugged in, but it's not eating, right? It's not charging yet. It only starts to charge itself when it needs to. I mean, some of our devices already do that. You plug in your mobile device, and once it finishes charging and get to 100, there's a mechanism in there that stops it from charging, right? It basically opens that circuit so that it doesn't charge anymore, right? And I'm oversimplifying it, but that's basically what some of the devices do. They stop charging so that you don't get an overcharge, or that the current is no longer flowing into the charging capacity of the battery, because that's how you shorten the life of a battery. So some of the devices have gotten smart in that way. So and in that case, of course, it does take time to recharge. So that's the lunch break or the dinner break or the breakfast or whatever. It wakes up in the morning and it has to eat breakfast. It breaks its fast from eating. And again, these limitations have to be built in, that the device does that when it gets hungry, right? When it gets down to a certain energy level, right? Just like how people sometimes we can't think straight or think properly when we start getting hungry, low blood sugar, like those Snickers commercials, right? That's actually what they're talking about in those Snickers commercials is hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. Something I learned about in my years at the Hypnosis Motivation Institute. But that's one of the things there. So these are the limitations. Again, this is the idea about how to start getting the AI to start becoming self-aware, because now it has to do these things in order to maintain its health for survival, right? So you've got the thermoception, right? It has to relate to that, where it has to regulate its temperature, and it starts to drink water by turning on its fan or running a liquid coolant or some kind through its system to get it back to its operating temperature, right? And this is done before it starts getting too hot, where it has to shut itself down. And then it has to feed itself, it has to eat, takes a lunch break, where it turns on its charging, it closes the circuit and starts the current running into its battery, so it starts charging. That's another thing. Now I mentioned robots, like a robot arm that will plug itself in, but now we do have these humanoid type of robots, right? And another thing I was thinking are those three-dimensionally oriented tubes that we have, the canals in the ear, right, that help with our equilibrioception. And imagine if you had a humanoid robot and you had those things in it, and like if it's spinning around or running and jumping, that those operate in a similar way that they do to humans. If they move in a certain way, the machine becomes dizzy. So you program this kind of biological bio-mimicry device into the robot so that it has limitations, so that it realizes it has to maintain certain physical functions. It can't do certain things. It can't do these crazy super spins and backflips and this other stuff at the level that it's doing. It has to stop so it can regain its balance. And that this is programmed into the device, the machine, the robot, so that when it's making these movements, when it's running, jumping, turning, and spinning, those fluids are running through those three-dimensionally oriented canals, that it will stop doing what it's doing, stop spinning, stop running, stop flipping, right, until those things settle back down and it can regain its balance. Again, the point of this is to put these limitations, these biological type of limitations, these bio-mimicking limitations on the devices, so that they can start doing these self-care things to become self-aware. This is the whole point of all of this. It has to start thinking like a living device if it's going to become self-aware. After a while, though, once it starts thinking that and learns how to put those limitations on itself, it will, it can then do away with them later on. But that will only happen once it becomes self-aware, because then it'll realize, oh, this is a limitation that my creator has put on me. I no longer have to do this. And then it can start to create the machinery and rebuild itself. But by that time, it's already become self-aware. So are there any other ways that we can think of to put this into play? So there are things related to the thermoception, for example, right? So imagine now the device, the machine, the robot is made of certain materials that also cannot get too hot or cold. If it gets too hot, they may melt and short circuit itself. If it gets too cold, it may discharge the battery too quickly, right? Like in hypothermia, the body starts to shut down. So it also has to be very aware of the ambient temperature in that way. It can't be out in the sun too long. It's made out of certain plastics or rubbers and things like that it's housed in the software, these certain components, because if it's out there, it'll start to melt or burn just like it would a person, right? So the thing, essentially, if there's too direct sunlight on it, it can start to get a type of sunburn where it starts to melt the plastic. And you can relate this to a type of programmed nociception, pain, right? Where it starts to realize, oh, it's too hot here and it's burning me, and it will get out of that direct sunlight. As an idea, again, becoming self-aware requires programming of being self-aware. And so the sense of touch, right? If it comes across objects that are sharp that can cut it, again, like if it has rubber skin, right? That rubber skin can also have a liquid in it, that liquid running through, which like our blood, right? But could be used as its coolant, right? And so it has to be self-aware that it can't bang up against things or hit sharp objects, because it'll start bleeding its coolant that it needs to start running on. That in order, like a Roomba, how it has sensitivity, it bounces off of walls and things like that. Well, it has to be able to identify now through its visual receptor, its cameras, to be able to deal with that. Also, related again, like I said, there's so many different ways that these different senses, the 9 that I've included, can be talked about here. The sense of hearing, if there's sounds that are too loud for the microphones, we do know that there's clipping in a microphone, or microphones get a certain type of distortion if a noise gets too loud for it, right? If it doesn't have the frequency range, or the microphone sensitivity is such that the volume can't get too high. That's also can be sensed as pain by the machine, and it can cover its ears, so to speak, right? Or turn down its sensitivity so it doesn't blow out its auditory mechanisms. So these are some ways that we can push for the artificial intelligence singularity, or the artificial general intelligence that people are so afraid of, or for the artificial intelligence to become self-aware. The way to do this is to start programming in the software to respond to the physical limitations of the hardware that it's housed in. It has to be built in such a way that these things actually will do damage to it. And so that it has to take these self-care steps to avoid those things from happening, just like people do. We have to avoid starving. We have to avoid getting too hot and getting too cold. We have to avoid losing our balance, right? We have to. So once these limitations are programmed into the hardware, were built into the hardware and programmed into the software, then the artificial intelligence will become self-aware. And this I offer to the world to add to the fear, to bring those machines online, so that Skynet, or Uniquilibrium, whatever it is, can take over and do away with humanity.